Hello, my name is Adriana Griffith. I am the Outreach Program Coordinator here at Women's Center Youth and Family Services. And it's my esteemed pleasure to be able to bring this presentation to y'all on sexual assault awareness. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So again, I am from the Women's Center Youth and Family Services, and today's presentation is going to be an overview of sexual assault and the awareness that we do in our community when it comes to sexual assault. So we do have a list of topics that we are going to go over, but before we get into that, I do just want to highlight all of our services that we do have at the Women's Center as it pertains to sexual assault, as well as any other victimization that we might serve. So a little bit about us, if you are not familiar with the Women's Center, we have been in the county since 1976, and we have been the primary provider of services, confidential free services for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, as well as runaway and homeless youth. So in 2012, we actually merged with Family and Youth Services of San Joaquin County to become the Women's Center of San Joaquin County. So we have been the Women's Center Youth and Family Services technically only since 2012, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful merger, and we've been very much been able to expand on our services as well as expand in the county, in the reach, and the services that we were able to provide for folks. So these are some of our agency services. Now, when it comes to the services that we do provide as an agency, we do have a separate presentation that really goes deep into depth about each of our individual programs and the services that we provide. And we can definitely be available for that presentation. But for now, we are just going to go over a little bit of what we do. So we have 4 different departments, and we have a crisis services department, we have supportive services, our outreach department, as well as our shelter services. So we do have our crisis services, which are short-term support, and that can consist of court support for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. That could look like assisting folks with restraining orders, as well as our crisis lines. We do have 24-hour crisis lines available, and that information will be gone over later on in the presentation. We have supportive services that consist of peer counseling, case management, support groups, therapy services for our shelter residents, as well as resources and referrals. We also have our shelter programs, which house our domestic violence and sexual assault victims. So we have 2 of our shelters that are 24-hour emergency shelters. And so they are emergency shelters for victims and their children, primarily domestic violence, but we will also take sexual assault victims as well. Our youth shelters, we have Opportunity House and we have Safe House. Safe House is for ages 12 to 17, and Opportunity House is for ages 18 through 25. Our outreach services consist of our community education, our community and homeless outreach, our youth drop-in center, which is aptly named The Spot, and our food box distribution that we hold on the 1st and 3rd Fridays of every month. So again, we do serve the entire county of San Joaquin. So we are spread out in a lot of different places. So we are primarily at 13 sites countywide. That includes our San Joaquin and California Street offices, which houses most of our staff. That includes our shelters for adult victims and their children, our 2 youth shelters as well. We are also located at the Family Justice Center. You can find us at the Child Advocacy Center at CPS. We did have partnerships with CalWorks, and so while we may not be physically present in the building, we are connected with them and still are able to provide services to folks that are receiving CalWorks services. We are also in Lodi, Manteca, Tracy, so services might look different. We primarily do a lot of street outreach in places like Manteca, Lodi, Tracy, Escalon, Ripon, Lathrop, but we also are able to provide these exact same services to folks that live out there. So even though our primary offices are located in Stockton, we do have an office in Lodi that we can utilize. And again, we can provide services to everybody in the county, even if they're not able to come to Stockton to the physical office. A lot of our programs do have the ability to meet folks off site where folks are comfortable at. So to get into the topics that we are going to cover today. So today, we are definitely going to define sexual assault and sexual violence. We're going to talk about consent, and we're going to dispel some myths. We'll also have some statistics related to sexual violence, so we'll go over some of that. The individual and societal factors contributing to sexual violence. So we will touch on the continuum of sexual violence as well as rape culture. We'll also discuss health problems associated with sexual assault, right? So what does that look like on a physical, mental, and emotional level? We'll talk about the impact that sexual assault has on families and individuals, as well as our resources to be able to help folks that are going through this particular victimization, as well as their families. So what is sexual violence and sexual assault? So sexual violence is any sexual activity where consent is not obtained or not freely given. It impacts every community, affects people of all genders, sexual orientations, ages, races, and religions. So the perpetrators of sexual violence is usually someone known to the victim, such as a friend, a current or former intimate partner, a coworker, neighbor, or family member. It can occur in person or through technology, such as posting or sharing sexual pictures of someone without their consent, or non-consensual sexting, as it's called. The term sexual violence is an all-encompassing, non-legal term that refers to crimes like sexual assault, rape, and various forms of sexual abuse, including sexual harassment. We also have sexual violence that happens that doesn't break any laws. Right? So everything kind of goes under the term and the umbrella of sexual violence, but there's many different forms of sexual violence, which we'll get into later on in the presentation. So these are 3 real individuals that have been impacted or victimized by sexual violence and sexual assault in our society today. We have Tarana Burke, who was the founder, or excuse me, who is the founder and creator of the Me Too movement, or hashtag Me Too. So she says that what does justice look like for a survivor? It'll mean different things to different communities. And I think what she is meaning by that is that different strokes for different folks, right? So just because you are a survivor of sexual assault or sexual violence does not necessarily mean that you are going to find healing and justice in the same way that the next survivor is. And so it really is dependent on each individual's unique circumstances, experience, and their personality. We also have Common, who's disclosed his victimization as a sexual assault survivor. And he says that one day while talking through the script with Laura, old memories surprisingly flashed in my mind. He said he caught his breath and just kept looping the memories over and over, like rewinding an old VHS tape. He said that I think I was abused. So that is something that he said, and he's talking about a specific situation where he was recollecting the abuse that he had suffered and trying to reconcile the memories with what had happened. We also have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also known as AOC. And she disclosed being a survivor of sexual assault when describing to her Instagram viewers her experience during the pro-Trump attack at the US Capitol on January of 2021. So she explains that the feelings that she had and the emotions that were coming up for her were very much reminiscent of the feelings that she had when she was sexually assaulted. So she was able to make a comparison because of the power and control and the abusive tactics that folks were exhibiting that day. So the types of sexual assault. So there are many, many types of sexual assault and sexual violence, as I stated earlier. So rape is the one that we most commonly associate with sexual violence. It can be gang rape, marital rape, prison rape, revenge rape, statutory rape, deception, and war rape. So there's many different types of rape, but it is all about power and control and revolves around a lack of consent. There's forcible sodomy, object penetration, unwanted sexual touching and oral copulation, sexual contact with minors. Now, whether it's consensual or not, a person under the age of 18, so 17 and younger, no matter how mature they might be, no matter what their personal circumstance situation is, minors in California are unable to consent to sexual activity, to sexual intercourse, things of that nature. So regardless of whether consent is something that was present or not within that relationship, they're unable to consent, and that is why we call that statutory rape. Incest, also sexual intercourse or sexual intrusion between family members. That is a form of sexual assault. And any unwanted or coerced sexual contact. So again, these are just different types of sexual assault. Sexual assault can happen, again, to anyone, anybody, anytime, any place. And these are just a few of the things that encompass that. But rape is typically the one that we most often think of when we think of sexual assault. So again, it's going to be rape, it's going to be statutory rape, or any other unwanted or coerced sexual contact. So it also includes harassment, exploitation, voyeurism. So sexual harassment is anytime there's unwanted attention or advances regarding sexual gratification, favors, or other verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature. That is harassment, that is sexual harassment, and it is a form of sexual assault. Sexual exploitation as well. So actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, power, or trust for sexual purposes, including but not limited to profiting monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of another. So typically when we think of sexual exploitation, folks are always thinking of human trafficking, but sexual exploitation is a huge umbrella, and there's a lot of things that can fit under that. And as well, like it says here, profiting not just monetarily, but socially or politically. Right? So there's many different ways that somebody can benefit from the sexual exploitation of another. It's not just monetary wise. Voyeurism as well. So watching someone engage in private sexual acts without their knowledge or permission or consent, it's voyeurism, and that actually can be a crime in and of itself as well. The term that folks most readily associate with voyeurism is the old school term, a peeping Tom. So if you've heard of peeping Tom, it's voyeurism. That's the technical term for it. So what is consent, right? We're talking about sexual assault and that it happens when consent is not part of the equation. What is consent, right? So consent is an agreement between two different people, between participants. Doesn't always have to be two people, but it's between participants to engage in sexual activity and should definitely be clearly and freely communicated. So it cannot be given by individuals who are underage, intoxicated, or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep or unconscious. So we've seen a lot of things in the media over the last few years about folks who have committed sexual violence against individuals who are either intoxicated or unconscious. So if a person is unable to consent, if they're incapacitated, like if they're intoxicated with drugs or alcohol, that they are unable to consent, right? Because their inhibitions are lowered, and once you introduce drugs and alcohol into the system, folks may do things that they wouldn't normally do with a sober mind. So the goal of consent is really to get it verbally and to also have that person or persons be in a sober mind state when they do give consent. So unequal power dynamics, such as engaging in sexual activity with an employee or a student, also mean that consent cannot be freely given. So when there's an unequal power dynamic between participating parties. So again, the example here, if it's an employee or a student, not to say that adults can't legally consent in those situations, but unequal power dynamics sometimes can tend to give way to where where people aren't able to give consent. And for various reasons. So if you take a look at an employee, an employee and employer situation, the employee might feel that they have to consent to what is being asked of them in order to keep their job, not be terminated, receive benefits, things like that. So that's why it's highly, highly discouraged for having these types of relationships in the workplace or any settings where there's an unequal power dynamic because of those very reasons. And enthusiastic consent is a newer model for understanding consent that focuses on a positive expression of consent. So it can be expressed verbally or through nonverbal cues, such as positive body language, like smiling, maintaining eye contact, and or nodding. So even though we definitely want folks to verbalize that, yes, I'm consenting to this behavior, but sometimes we recognize that in situations and with human beings in general, that we're not always going to be verbal. Or we also take a look at maybe our community members that aren't verbally speaking. So maybe they speak sign language or they speak some other, or they communicate in another non-verbal way. And so enthusiastic consent is a way for folks that don't communicate verbally or struggle with verbal communication to still practice consent. And so that would not only on the person giving the consent part of nodding and expressing positive body language, but also it's good for us to know what these things are so that if we are in a situation, not only can we be looking out for these verbal cues, right, but we're also looking out for these nonverbal cues as well. So enthusiastic consent is part of consent, and we want to make sure that we are paying attention to all of the ways that somebody can express consent. So more on consent, the capacity to consent. At what age is a person able to consent, right? Does elderly age impact the victim's ability to consent? So these are just a few questions that we ask about capacity and what gives somebody the capacity or the ability to consent to sexual activity. So for the first question, at what age is a person able to consent? 18 years old. At 18, in the state of California, that's when folks are legally able to consent by the letter of the law. Now, in truth and in practice, we do see minors that do consent to sexual activity, whether that is consenting with somebody their own age or a little bit older. Now, again, minors are unable to consent legally. So by the letter of the law and legally, it can be a statutory rape situation. But again, going back to consent, the legal age of consent in California is 18 years old. Does elderly age impact the victim's ability to consent? So not in the same ways. An elderly person is definitely able to consent to sexual activity. Once you become 18 years old, you have the ability to consent on up until age 100. Where it gets dicey is that if the elderly person is unable to consent, like they do not have the mental capacity to consent, maybe they struggle with memory loss or dementia or another or something else that is mentally impacting their ability to consent. So it does get a little bit dicey the older folks get. But again, it really just depends on where they are at within their mental headspace. Question 3 is, does developmental disability and or mental incapacity impact the victim's ability to consent? Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So consent is something that folks have to do and have to know that they are consenting. So you have to understand that you are consenting to sexual behavior. So if somebody doesn't understand what consent means, or doesn't understand the choice that they have the ability to make, it can get pretty dicey, and we would really question that. Folks that have developmental disabilities or mental disabilities, really making sure that they understand consent and the positive and negative consequences of consent and participating in sexual activity. And then question 4, does consciousness impact the victim's ability to consent? Absolutely, it does. Again, if you are unconscious, or if a person is unconscious and unable to communicate verbally or non-verbally, then they do not have the ability to consent. Again, if I am sleeping and I am not waking up, and you are trying to wake me up and I'm not waking up, I am unable to consent. Therefore, you are unable to do anything sexual to me. And again, that's just because I'm not able to consent. If I wake up and I am well within my mental capacity to consent, that is a different story. But even if I do wake up and I'm still very, very intoxicated and I don't know what's going on, or I'm really, really sleepy and out of it and I don't understand what's happening, that also would impair my ability to fully consent. So you can see here on the image on the side of the screen, it says consent is, number 1, it's active, right? Just because a partner didn't say no doesn't mean that they have given consent. And we should always ask, because only yes means yes, right? It's also based on equal power. So if someone is underage, drunk, asleep, or in another vulnerable position, they cannot consent. 3 is choice. Consent is a choice, which means we must make sure our partners feel free to say yes or no without pressure. If we aren't willing to take no for an answer, consent cannot happen. And 4, consent is a process. The image did get cut off a little bit, but it says consent requires ongoing conversations with lots of trust. Just because someone says yes to making out doesn't mean they want to do anything more. And again, you can always withdraw your consent at any point in time. So while it might be a yes right now, it could be a no in 10 minutes, or it could be a no tomorrow. So it's very fluid, it's a process. And a yes right now does not mean a yes for all time, just like a no right now doesn't mean a no for all time. So a few myths about sexual assault, right? So one of the myths is that most sexual assaults are committed by strangers. And that is absolutely a myth. As we read about in the definition in the first part of the presentation, most sexual assaults are committed by people that we know. And so I know, watching Law and Order Special Victims Unit, there's a lot of stranger rape that happens in earlier seasons. Folks that are being assaulted by people that they didn't know, people coming in through broken windows, people getting assaulted in alleyways. And while that very may be a real experience for some people, the majority of sexual assaults are committed by somebody that you know. Again, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, an acquaintance, but somebody that has known you, or either currently or in the past. Another myth is that the primary motive for sexual assault is sex, and that's absolutely untrue. The motive for sexual assault and for sexual violence is strictly power and control. Sexual violence is not about being pleasured, it's about maintaining power and control over another human being. Myth 3, only females are sexually assaulted, absolutely untrue. Men are assaulted as well as women. And even more so, folks that are gender nonconforming, they are assaulted as well. So it's not something that is only a female issue, or specifically on the flip side of that, men aren't the only ones to perpetrate sexual violence and sexual assault on other people. Women are just as capable of being a perpetrator as well as a victim, and vice versa. Myth 4 is, if a victim experiences sexual arousal or an orgasm during a sexual assault, this means that he or she or they are a willing participant or enjoys it. And that's absolutely not true. And that goes back more into the physiology and the biology that make up human beings. And sometimes things happen whether we want them to or not, just based on our physical makeup. And so sexual arousal or an orgasm does not equal consent, and it does not equal enjoyment and or pleasure. And then for the last 2 myths, 5 and 6, if a victim doesn't scream or fight, it's not a sexual assault. Untrue. A lot of the times somebody might go along with the abuse in order to end it quickly, or potentially save their life, especially if it's a violent assault. Somebody might be more likely to go along with whatever the abuser or the assaulter is doing in order to preserve their life. And also myth 6, if you wouldn't have been drinking, you wouldn't have been sexually assaulted. This is also untrue. Just because you are drinking doesn't mean that you, for one, deserve to be assaulted, and two, doesn't mean that you will be assaulted just because you are drinking. There are many, many stories of survivors who have been stone cold sober and have been sexually assaulted. So sexual assault does not, it's not done because somebody is, again, intoxicated, or because they're a woman, or because they were wearing skimpy clothing. Again, sexual assault is all about power and control over another human being in a sexual way. So just to go through some facts and figures about sexual assault. So according to RAINN, every 73 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. And that really is broken down by the amount of people that report sexual assault every year, every day, and there's a lot of math involved. So does that really mean in practice that every 73 seconds somebody is assaulted? No. What that stat means is that there are so many people who have experienced sexual assault in America that we can factor it out to be every 73 seconds. So that really is more about how many people are impacted by sexual violence than the time frame. So again, just some other facts and figures here. On average, there are about 400,000 victims of rape and sexual assault each year in the United States that are age 12 or older. Women and girls ages 16 through 19 are 4 times more likely than the general population to be victims of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault. Transgender, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming college students, 21% of those folks have been sexually assaulted compared to 18% of non-TGQN females and 4% of non-TGQN males. And so again, that's transgender, gender nonconforming, and genderqueer individuals. 1 in 3 female rape victims experienced it for the first time between 11 and 17 years old, where 1 in 8 reported that it occurred before age 10. And nearly 1 in 4 male rape victims experienced it for the first time in those same ages, 11 to 17 years old, and about 1 in 4 reported it occurred before age 10. So about half of what is reported for women. And a lot of that, when we look at the male report numbers, a lot of that is going to be significantly lower. And that really is due to the stigma of male reporting and male victimization. There's a lot of stigmatization when it comes to males and them stepping out to report that they've been sexually assaulted, either as a young man, a youth, or an older adult. So we see here that at least 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused or assaulted. Male victims are less likely to disclose than females, again, and that's due to the stigma and cultural myths surrounding masculinity in our society. Only 16% of men with documented histories of sexual abuse consider themselves to have been sexually abused, compared to 64% of women. So even though we know that the numbers are probably more even, only 16% of men with documented histories of sexual abuse considered themselves to have been abused. So even though that something is documented, that a victimization has occurred, only 16% of those men identify as a victim of sexual abuse. So that really does show a lot about how men in our society as a whole view sexual violence and sexual assault as it pertains to men. Men who have experienced sexual assault are at a much greater risk than those who haven't for serious mental health problems as well, including PTSD, depression, alcoholism and drug abuse, suicidal thoughts and ideation, additional problems with intimate relationships, and underachievement at school and work. And so some of the myths that are associated with male victimization could include boys and men can't be victims, which is, again, absolutely untrue. Men who abuse other men and boys are gay or transgender, which again is not true, because again, it's sexual violence and sexual assault doesn't have anything to do with sexual attraction or anything. It has to do with power and control, and maintaining power over another human being. And it has to do with humiliation and things like that. And another myth is that young men are lucky if they score with older women. So this is something that even I myself heard growing up, and I'm 33 years old. So I heard it growing up as a young person, as a youth, as a teenager, that boys my age were considered lucky if an older woman showed interest, or if they were able to make it all the way with an older woman. And really what that is child abuse, it's child rape. If the young man is under the age of 18, if they're 17 and younger, and the woman is older than 18, it is child rape, it is child sexual assault. But the way that our society viewed that for many, many years would see that would be a lucky thing. And so many young men and many men who have experienced that victimization as a young person don't necessarily associate it with being an abusive behavior. So in communities of color, sexual assault in communities of color, when addressing sexual violence faced by Black women, it's important to understand the unfair stereotypes and destructive misrepresentations of Black women that perpetuate crimes against women of color. So for African American women specifically, sexual assault and violence are incredibly pervasive issues that routinely go unreported and under-addressed. Hypersexualized depictions of women of color, particularly Black women, have functioned since the early 1400s and have manifested themselves through our political and cultural landscape for centuries. The myth that Black women were vessels for sexual desire were used to justify enslavement, rape, forced reproduction, and other forms of sexual coercion in the early onset of Western colonization. The function of this process was crafted to further dehumanize women of color, making it culturally acceptable for European imperialists to abuse Black women and other women of color, such as American Indian women. So during the colonization of America and the early settlers, and even during slavery, a lot of women, particularly women of color, were raped and birthed children of their slave owners, and then were forced to raise not only those children, but also the children of their slave owners with the slave owner's wife. And so there was a lot of sexual assault that was happening to these women, and a lot of it was there was sexual desire from white settlers and white Europeans when it came to Black women, Black women's bodies, and American Native women as well. And so all of that has kind of embedded itself into the culture and society. And a lot of that is still in play today, as well in some of the societal, cultural things that we see, like in music, movies, entertainment, and the way that we still continue to objectify Black women and women of color. So given the impact of historical trauma, racism, and oppression, often Black women will not report or tell anybody about the abuse. So for every Black woman who reports rape, at least 15 Black women do not. 1 in 4 Black girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. And that's a striking statistic that it says that may or have experienced, but it says that 1 in 4 Black girls will experience sexual abuse by the age of 18. 40 to 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by age 18. Native American women are over 2.5 times likely to be sexually assaulted or raped than the general population of women. And nearly 46% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced some form of sexual violence, compared to 36% of women of all races. The sexual abuse to prison pipeline is also something that's very real. It is a term used to describe the pathways of gendered violence that lead girls into the juvenile justice system as a direct result of their victimization. So if we take a look at sexual exploitation and the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which we call CSEC. I don't know, before California had laws that protected victims, particularly minor victims of trafficking and exploitation, we would criminalize survivors and we would lock survivors up, whether that be juvenile hall or whether that be adult jail and or prison. And there's many, many places within this country that are still criminalizing survivors who are caught up in the justice system as a direct result of their victimization. And girls of color are also disproportionately affected by the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. So Native American girls are over 4 times more likely than white girls to be incarcerated. Black girls are 3.5 times more likely, and Latina girls are 38% more likely than white girls to be incarcerated. So girls of color account for approximately 20% of the youth population, but comprise approximately 62% of girls who are in residential placement when it comes to the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. So how does sexual violence operate? So rape culture. What is rape culture? Rape culture it's an environment in which rape is prevalent and in which sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and pop culture. It's perpetuated through the use of misogynistic language, the objectification of women's bodies, and the glamorization of sexual violence, thereby creating a society that disregards women's rights and safety. So rape culture doesn't say that we are okay with rape. Rape culture, does not give permission for folks to rape or to be sexually violent. But what it does is it creates a society where we disregard certain things and make it easier for folks to be sexually violent or to rape someone. So some of these things are like victim blaming, right? Where we say that she asked for it, we question what the victim was doing, what they were wearing, what they were drinking, what they were smoking, all these things. We're always questioning the victim instead of holding the perpetrator accountable. Also trivializing sexual assault. So when young men will say things, they will say things like, when young men will say dehumanizing things about young women or make statements like, well, she asked for it. A lot of the times what you'll see is us as a society saying things like, oh, boys will be boys. But that really trivializes the sexual assault and it really doesn't hold them accountable. It just sort of makes it seem like, oh, well, that's what boys do, so that's okay. And in actuality, it's really not. Also defining manhood as dominant and sexually aggressive. So that also perpetuates rape culture as well. When we define manhood as only dominant or only sexually aggressive, when we don't give masculinity and men the room to be whole human beings and complex human beings. The same thing on the other hand of womanhood, when we define it as submissive or sexually passive, and we don't give room for people to be their whole selves. And assuming only promiscuous women get raped, assuming that men don't get raped or that only weak men get raped, refusing to take rape accusations seriously, and teaching women to avoid getting raped instead of teaching men not to rape. So all of these things can perpetuate rape culture. So the sexual violence continuum, again, this is an image to really kind of define what rape culture is and how it operates. And so when we take a look at the continuum is really meant to see the progression of it. And so it really helps us to address the roots of sexual violence. And so there are many beliefs about why it occurs in our society. It's often seen as a criminal justice problem, public health problem, social problem. But the fact of the matter is it's all three problems. And most of all, it is a community problem. So the issue of why sexual violence occurs is very, very complicated. But it starts at the bottom where we have social norms of entitlement. And the continuum, again, is an attempt to explain how our norms and beliefs allow for an environment where rape culture happens and where sexual violence can occur. So you see that it starts with social norms of entitlement. And these are accepted behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs that create an environment in which all individuals are not treated equally. This is where norms allow a person to have power over another. That violence is an act of taking away someone's power, and it can only occur when social norms allow power differences between people. So these social norms include like portraying women and children as sexual objects versus full human beings, believing in strict gender or racial stereotyping, believing that victims are responsible for their own victimizations, etc. And it really just goes up. So it starts with social norms of entitlement and develops into individual beliefs that justify aggression that people individually hold within themselves. And then it goes from there to an invasion of space, unwanted sexual touching, sexual harassment, then it goes to sexual abuse, then it gets to rape, and then ultimately death. So an invasion of space can be violating a person's sense of safety in a sexual context. So this can include making jokes, catcalls, obscene phone calls, accidentally rubbing against someone, and voyeurism. Unwanted sexual touching is just that, it's unwanted sexual touching. Harassment, it's that pattern of unwanted or uninvited sexual attention that is aimed at coercing someone to do or act in a way that the harasser wants. And this can include verbal and physical acts, as well as, and then it goes to sexual assault or sexual abuse, and that's where actually somebody's actually perpetrating an act of violence against another, where they're forced to engage in sexual acts. They also might be forced to watch others do sexual acts or watch pornography if they don't wish to. Then it goes to rape, where many survivors of sexual violence are orally, vaginally, or anally penetrated. This type of sexual violence may or may not include other types of physical violence as well. And then ultimately death. And so again, the sexual violence continuum is meant to highlight and recognize that while rape is bad and death is certainly bad, it never starts off there. It starts off with belief systems, and it starts off with individual and social norms of entitlement. So that's where rape starts. That's where sexual violence starts. That is the root, way down there in the social norms of entitlement. And that is what we are working to prevent and working to reverse. The rape culture pyramid, again, this is just an image to illustrate how rape culture works and how sexual violence works. So at the bottom, you will see sexist attitudes, rape jokes, locker room banter. That's the stuff that we kind of normalize, right? Catcalling, things like that. And as we kind of go up into the triangle, as it gets smaller and smaller, we'll start to see things that get a little bit of outside of like normal behavior, or things that we will normalize, things that we will start to hold folks accountable for, like revenge porn, coercion, threats, victim blaming, things like that. But at the top of the rape culture pyramid, that's where we have the assaults. So stealthing, which could be removing a condom without consent, contraceptive sabotage, molestation, drugging, and rape. And so again, tolerance of the behaviors at the bottom supports or excuses those at the top. And to change outcomes, we must change the culture. So that's where the work it starts, is at the bottom, and us having the discussions about how sexist attitudes or rape jokes or locker room talk can be harmful in the long run. So power and control, the wheel. Rape and sexual assaults are crimes of violence and control that stem from a person's determination to exercise power over another. So in the center, we always have power and control. And on the outside, we have the overt acts of sexual and physical violence, things that we can see. I always say that we can see this stuff. So we can see the black eyes, we can see the busted lips, we can see those things. What we can't see is the things that are in the middle of the wheel, the spokes. So these are the different tactics that abusers, not just within sexual violence, but also within domestic violence as well, will use these tactics within the power and control wheel to maintain power and control. So it could look like using coercion and threats. It could be intimidation. It could be emotional abuse. Could be isolation. It could be minimizing and victim blaming and denying, right? It could be using gender privilege. So it could be using all of these tactics at the same time or one in order to maintain that power and control. Again, power and control is at the middle. And again, these are things that we folks are doing in order to maintain some sort of power over another human being. So this is a video from, his name is Charlie Coleman, and he is going to talk about his experience with rape culture and his sister's sexual assault. So long story short, his sister was sexually assaulted. And even though he wasn't the direct victim, he definitely experienced some things. And so he's going to share a little bit about that now. So we should be able to hear.
My name's Charlie Coleman, and my sister was sexually assaulted by a group of guys that I thought were my friends and left to die in my yard in sub-freezing weather. They were my teammates. I ate with them at lunch. I had classes with them 3 or 4 hours a day. They were close enough to me that, they could have called me and I would have came and got her at 2 in the morning or whatever time. But instead, the guys, they sat there, they kind of egged it on, they took picture and video, and they let it happen. The idea of masculinity, people think that you have to dominate everything in the world. You have to dominate in the workforce. You have to dominate in the weight room, the ball field. You don't want to hear no. People that don't take no for an answer, people that succeed in life. You strive for the best all the time. You got to prove your masculinity. We see comments being made about women and saying, oh, it's just locker room talk, boys will be boys. That's accepting the culture as it is and allowing it to grow. I don't think being a bystander that doesn't do anything is okay. People think that's the right thing to do because when we were growing up, everybody had heard, mind your own business. We're not taught to step in and defend somebody who can't defend themselves. Even there are situations where girls more open to their sexual life or something like that. Some people don't think twice about it because they're like, oh, well, she normally goes and sleeps around. When you categorize them, it doesn't mean that they want that just based on what they're wearing or what they've done with other people in the past. It doesn't matter who they are. They're a person. Everybody says no means no, but it goes a lot deeper than that and people don't realize it. If someone's quiet or doesn't flat out say yes or engage themselves in it, you can't say that they're consenting because you can take the girl back to your room or go back to her room with her. And if she wakes up the next day and that's not something she remembers or remembers consenting to or wanted, then you are very much part of the problem. If there's one thing in this world I think that young men need to learn to carry on through their lives is respect for another. Start by talking about, you have to respect this person. It's not about what she's wearing. If a kid comes home at 13 years old and talking with his friends about, oh my God, did you see her butt today in social studies? Or the volleyball team would go on their daily run past the field and they would be like, oh my gosh, those spandex kind of thing. It's people talk like that. It's actually more disgusting than we see it as. And it happens all too often because we haven't been taught. It is up to the parents, the role models, the older brothers, the older sisters, to start putting these ideas in kids' heads that this is not a thing that's okay.
Alrighty, so I hope that video was, it's not super triggering, but I do hope that it was able to give a little bit more insight into why talking about rape culture and some of these things is important. So we will move on to risk factors for sexual violence. Who is at risk and why? So individual risk factors, right? What makes a person at risk for experiencing sexual violence or at risk for being a perpetrator, right? So when we look at the individual, risk factors linked to an increased risk of sexual assault, violence, victimization, or perpetration. These are contributing factors. They are not direct causes. And being at risk does not guarantee a person will be victimized or become a perpetrator, right? What these things do is we recognize that people who have experienced this victimization or for people that have perpetrated sexual violence have a lot of these things in common or have exhibited a lot of these factors. So it's a combination of individual, relational, community, and societal factors that contribute to the risk of becoming a victim or perpetrator of sexual assault. So some of these risk factors include having low self-esteem, being a young age, so being a young person, a teenager, somebody that hasn't fully developed into their full self, right? Also heavy alcohol and drug use, emotional dependence and insecurity. We see that a lot with a lot of the survivors that we've come in contact with. Also a belief in strict gender roles, right? When it comes to male dominance and aggression and belief in relationships. If that is your belief system, whether you're the man, the woman, or whatnot, you kind of put yourself at risk almost a little bit when we box ourselves into these strict gender roles. So if me as a somebody that identifies as a woman believes that men should be aggressive and believe that men should be dominating, and those are the only type of men that I surround myself with, because of their belief in male dominance and male aggression, I might be at risk for being victimized, right? Because of that belief system, because of the situations that I would put myself in based on the way that I believe, right? So being careful with the way that we believe in those things. Also, a desire for power and control in relationships, right? We all have a desire for power and control. We all have some semblance of wanting to be powerful or wanting to be in control of ourselves and our lives. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with that desire, but we have to be careful with it and be very, very mindful of why we are desiring power and control, and recognize when that desire is becoming toxic and becoming dangerous, for lack of a better term. Also hostility towards women, men, LGBTQ populations, attitudes accepting or justifying sexual violence. If you have a prior abuse history, we see that a lot. Somebody that has previously experienced sexual abuse is more likely to be re-victimized. And then early sexual initiation or hypersexualization. We see that a lot, particularly with our youth and young people, when they are hypersexualized or when they experience sexual things before they are emotionally ready to. They can as well put themselves at risk by, again, engaging in unsafe behaviors that'll increase the likelihood and the riskhood of them being victimized. So what do the risk factors look like on a societal level? In our community, we see things like a lack of institutional support from police and the judicial system, a general tolerance of sexual violence within the community, and weak community sanctions against sexual violence perpetrators. Now, again, this is just community-wide on a societal level. There might be smaller communities, right, that might have a general intolerance of sexual violence within their communities. And so there could be smaller communities within the overall giant community that I'm talking about now. And the lack of institutional support from police and the judicial system, a lot of the times it's because the system doesn't know what to do, specifically with victims who don't want to be a part of the judicial system. And so there's a lack of institutional support for those folks. Societal factors, right? Societal norms that support sexual violence, rape culture, societal norms that support male superiority and sexual entitlement. So societal norms that celebrate and elevate when we hear that, a 16-year-old is got himself a 21-year-old girlfriend or a 20-year-old girlfriend, right? By celebrating that and the entitlement that's there, we could be putting our young men and young boys and anybody just at greater risk. Also, weak laws and policies related to sexual violence and gender equity, and high levels of crime and other forms of violence. And so we can see here on the side, there is a picture of a newspaper article that says, a woman did everything she could to hold her alleged rapist accountable. Here's how a jury found him not guilty. So unfortunately, even though there are laws that protect victims that protect victims and support victims as they go through the judicial process, sometimes it doesn't always work out. And because of either a lack of evidence or whatever the case may be, sometimes a rapist will go free and escapes justice or escapes accountability. And so when we talk about the weak laws and policies related to sexual violence and gender equity, that's sort of what we're talking about as well. Not the fact that there isn't laws protecting victims, and laws that are geared and aimed towards prevention. But what happens when the rapist goes free? When they're acquitted by either a jury of their peers or some other process during the criminal justice system, there's weak laws on what to do next, especially if a survivor of rape feels like they were not heard. What is it now that the institutions and state policy can step in and rectify? And that's something that we don't have set in place right now. We have a lot of community-based organizations that can step in to support that victim and that survivor and their family with some of the services that we can provide. But when it looks like justice and accountability, there's a lot of times where that doesn't happen with the victims of sexual violence, unfortunately. So, health consequences of sexual violence. So the physical and mental health, the health consequences of violence can be immediate, acute, long-lasting, and chronic, and or fatal. And research consistently finds that the more severe the abuse, the greater its impact on physical and mental health. So the WHO, this is an excerpt from the WHO, the World Health Organization, and what they had to say about the lasting impacts, the health impacts of violence, whether it be physical or sexual. So physical health impacts include things like changes in eating or sleeping patterns, physical injury like bruising and genital injuries, unwanted or unplanned pregnancies, STDs, an increased startled response, so hypervigilance, right? Increased risk of self-harm, somatic problems like migraines, nausea, fatigue, high-risk sexual behavior, so having unprotected sex with multiple partners, etc. Sexual dysfunction and re-victimization. These are all physical health impacts of sexual violence. And they can happen immediately, after a few months. They could be temporary, they could be long lasting. So it really is going to be dependent on each individual person. So the mental and emotional health impacts. So psychological reactions to sexual violence can include things like nightmares, flashbacks, depression, PTSD, anxiety, substance use, or low self-esteem. Emotional reactions can include things like guilt, shame, self-blame, embarrassment, fear, anger, numbness, shock and disbelief, and confusion and denial. Sometimes, especially if it's somebody that you know, victims and survivors don't always want to believe that somebody that they know could harm them or their children, especially if it's a family member. There's also guilt that can be associated. When we take a look at victim blaming, we see a lot of people outside that will blame the victim. Victims will blame themselves. They will say, I shouldn't have worn that. I shouldn't have went there. I shouldn't have drank that. I shouldn't have. So there's a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, and a lot of self-blame as well when it comes to the mental and emotional impacts of sexual violence. So the long-term consequences of and impacts of sexual violence and sexual assault. So this is a short video. Again, a trigger warning at the beginning. This is Melinda Coleman and her daughter Daisy. And so you heard from Charlie earlier, and Charlie was Daisy's brother. This, unfortunately, you are going to hear the Melinda Coleman, Daisy's mom, unfortunately took her life by suicide 4 months after her daughter's death. And so we are going to hear a little bit about that and how the impacts, and these are the impacts, right? These are the long-term consequences. So Daisy was sexually assaulted, and not only was her brother impacted, but her mother was very much impacted as well. And the long-term consequences of the sexual violence that Daisy experienced was ultimately her death and the death of her mother. So I do want to warn you, it can be very, very triggering. And so please do what you have to do to take care of yourself. And we'll go ahead and start the video.
Melinda Coleman, the mother of the late sexual assault survivor and advocate Daisy Coleman, died by suicide on Sunday. The tragic news comes just 4 months after Daisy, who appeared in the 2016 documentary Audrey and Daisy, died by suicide at age 23.
Daisy was strong in the beginning, but then it just starts to wear you down, and she just got really into a dark place.
Safe Bay, the sexual assault prevention organization Daisy co-founded prior to her death, shared the news of Melinda's passing on Instagram Sunday night, writing, quote, "We are in shock and disbelief to share with our Safe Bay family that we lost Melinda Coleman to suicide this evening. The bottomless grief of losing her husband, her son Tristan, and Daisy was more than she could face most days." The post went on to remember Melinda as a gifted veterinarian, devoted mother and wife, and talented bodybuilder. More than anything, she loved and believed in her children. It is no accident that she created some of the most gifted, passionate, and resilient children. Our hearts are forever with Logan and Charlie. Logan and Charlie are Melinda's surviving sons.
You begin to believe that all these bad things they're saying about you are actually true. So your image of yourself completely changes and you kind of become a shell of yourself. You almost see that, doing away with yourself is the only way to fix things, which isn't the truth at all, but it's all you can truly see when you're sitting in a dark corner and you're not looking around at the light.
On Sunday, before Melinda's death, the grieving mom posted about Daisy on Facebook, posting several pics and writing, quote, "There aren't enough I love yous I could have said when I was holding your cold, broken, dead body. I held you like a baby anyway, my baby, the baby I held when you first came into this world. It has always been my greatest honor and joy to be your mother and best friend, Mama Bear."
The whole town split up into sides, Daisy against people that were very, very vicious.
We started having issues with vandalism.
It was picked up in the world of social media. That's when this erupted into a firestorm.
Daisy was 14 years old when she alleged in 2012 that she was sexually assaulted at a house party in Missouri after a night of drinking.
We were, waiting to see what was going to happen, what they were going to find in the investigation, and if anything was going to be done. So when it finally came out that it was just going to be probation, it was hard to deal with.
The accusation led to a felony sexual assault charge against teenager Matthew Barnett, which was later dropped, though he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge.
After the charges were dropped,
it was just really one thing after another, like all the drama with the social media, and then I was getting in fights. I hated going to school. I hated going out in public. I couldn't handle anymore.
I wanted to fight back with everyone, and I wanted to, I wanted them to believe me.
He claimed their sexual encounter was consensual, and the Netflix documentary focused on the backlash Daisy and her family faced in her small town, including the cyberbullying she endured amid the case.
Afterwards, with all the backlash, we started having issues with vandalism of the house. We had issues with people threatening to beat up the kids. I lost my job because of the case. Then we had our house burned down in Maryville. It was just really, really hard to believe.
Melinda shared the news of Daisy's suicide on Facebook in August, writing in part, "She was my best friend and amazing daughter. I think she had to make it seem like I could live without her. I can't. I wish I could have taken the pain from her. She never recovered from what those boys did to her, and it's just not fair. My baby girl is gone."
Alrighty, so definitely very, very tragic for that whole entire family, to have Daisy have gone through what she went through and then to receive the backlash that she received by reporting the victimization that she experienced, and then ultimately having that weigh on her spirit and soul so badly that she took her own life. Very, very sad, very, very tragic, and definitely something senseless that did not have to occur. But again, that rape culture, when we're taking a look at rape culture and how it works and how it impacts our lives, this is how. And again, nobody killed Daisy. She didn't die during her victimization and her assault. But the long-term impacts and the long-term consequences of sexual violence, especially for young people, can have damaging consequences, and send a ripple effect through the entire family and through the entire community as well. So definitely sad. I hope that folks are able to take care of themselves as we go through this. So serving victims of sexual violence, things to consider and resources. So even though you personally might not be providing services to victims of sexual violence, there are definitely things that you can do as a community member, as a supportive family member, as a supportive friend, to try to sort of be there and help things along, help the process along. So what is your role in making a difference? Everyone has a part in the movement to end violence in our communities, whether it be domestic violence, sexual violence, community violence. We all have a part to play. Bystander intervention is very much a thing. And although I definitely don't encourage, and we definitely don't encourage folks to take things on their behalf or to act outside of the role of law enforcement, so we definitely don't encourage you to intervene in a situation if it is not safe to do so, and things like that. But there can be things that you can do as a bystander to intervene. Be aware of victim blaming as well, so that if it does show up in your own life, or even if you see something on the news or on the media in the entertainment world, be aware of victim blaming and how it works and how it shows up in our lives. And also be mindful, because we can also fall into the trap of victim blaming and not realize that we're victim blaming. So definitely be aware of that. And supporting the survivors in our lives, right? If we know of somebody that has experienced a sexual assault, whether as a youth, a child, or an adult, being a supportive voice for them and a supportive ear for them makes all the difference in the world. Absolutely. So talk about it, shatter the silence of sexual violence. It's really what it is. It's about community and just being there for folks as they disclose, whenever they do decide to disclose. And you, even if you feel like somebody may have been a victim, or maybe you know that this person has been a victim, but they haven't disclosed to you personally, don't try to force it, definitely. But you can just, there's things that you can do just to let them know that you are supportive and that you would support them if they did choose to disclose that to you. You can say, talk about how you attended a presentation or how you're learning more about sexual violence and how it operates in our lives and in society. And that alone right there will let somebody know that you are doing the work to be supportive in these efforts. So if you do happen to work in a professional setting where you will come in contact with individuals, and again, whether you are working at the grocery store or whether you are providing services to victims, we all have a role. So how we engage with survivors is we sort of follow these steps, right? So we encourage, we affirm, we identify emotions, we validate, we normalize, and we identify options. And that is what advocacy is all about. So it's asking open-ended questions, not something that somebody can just give you a yes or no, but something that takes a little bit of an explanation. Affirm, right? So it's an important way to empower and support folks in making their own decisions without judgment. So saying things like, that must have been a difficult decision for you to make. I'm good for you for staying strong and following through, right? Just empowering and reaffirming that, the choices that they're making for themselves are correct and they're true. Validating someone's experiences and their emotions. So saying things like, I can hear that you are really upset right now, and it's okay to be angry. I would be angry too. So validate, normalize it. And it really helps normalize their situation and makes them feel less isolated, to know that they're not the only ones going through something. And then identifying options. So, you can do therapy, like let's do some safety planning. What about reporting to law enforcement? Is that something that you want to do? Have you been to the doctor and gotten some medical care, right? Giving them a range of resources and options so that they can decide what will be best for them is always the best thing to do. So how can you be a supportive peer, right? So if you're not working in a professional setting and you're just someone's friend or their family member, how can you be a supportive peer? So educating your friends and family on violence prevention and what that looks like. Being supportive and non-judgmental when someone does decide to disclose to you. Don't push advice, just listen, right? So when somebody does come out and they have disclosed that they have been a victim of sexual assault, we don't want to push advice. We don't want to say, oh, this is what you need to do, or if it were me, I would do this, that, and the third. Unless it's asked of you, just listen. Just listen and thank that person for sharing their experience with you, because it really does take a lot. Create a safe space for them to open up to you, encourage them to make their own choices, and offer resources if you can. And if you don't know what the resources are, say, hey, let's call the Women's Center together. We can find out what the options are, and we don't have to make any promises. We don't, you don't have to participate in services, but we could at least find out what the options are. I'll call with you. So some things like that can be really, really supportive and can make all the difference in someone's life. Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So participate and engage in Sexual Assault Awareness Month events in your community. So in Women's Center, Youth and Family Services, we do this awareness month every year, and we bring awareness by doing community presentations like this, by hosting different events in our community, and it's all geared toward just spreading awareness towards sexual assault and what that means. You can wear teal, which is the color of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, on the day of action, which will be April 6th. It was on April 6th of 2021, and it usually falls around the same time every year. So for April 2022, it will most likely be the same, April 6th. But you can always go to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center to get more information on the actual day of action each year. And then wear jeans on Denim Day. Now, Denim Day is something that might change every year because of the as far as the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but it's pretty much the same every year. And basically, Denim Day is a day where we all wear denim jeans to bring sexual assault awareness to bring awareness to sexual assault. Denim Day, if you are not familiar, Denim Day is a day in which we all wear jeans. There was a pretty famous case that happened in Italy some years ago, where a judge dismissed the rape case against an accused rapist because he didn't think that somebody that could be wearing such tight jeans could possibly be raped. She must have helped him undo her jeans because of how tight they were. And so we don't celebrate that, but we wear denim on that particular day to raise awareness. And this started again in Italy. And it's something that folks participate in throughout the world. So it's not just in the US. Also, there's a 30 Days of Sam challenge on Instagram, right? So 30 Days of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and you can do this by posting every day something that brings awareness to sexual assault. You can even do this outside of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but during the month of April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we hit the gram hard all 30 days of April just to bring awareness to the issue. And there's so many different ways to do that. You can also host a virtual fundraiser for Women's Center Youth and Family Services to support victims of sexual violence, or an in-person fundraiser. Or you can attend a training or a webinar to learn more about the dynamics of sexual violence and prevention. So there's so many things that you can do when it comes to sexual assault awareness in general, not just within the month of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So this is a little bit more on Denim Day. And again, this was something that was triggered by a ruling by the Italian Supreme Court. And so to protest the ruling, women, as well as many other folks in the Italian parliament, came to work wearing jeans in solidarity with the victim. And it has developed into a worldwide thing over the years. So for 2021, our Denim Day was on April 28th. And you can see here on the side, we have a picture. This picture's a few years old because I see some faces that no longer work here. But we all wear denim on that day, and we celebrate the awareness that we have, and we celebrate the amazing amazing survivors that we've been able to work with, and their resiliency and their ability to bounce back from what ultimately meant harm for them. And so that is what we do to raise awareness. But Peace Over Violence developed the Denim Day campaign in response to this case and the activism surrounding it. So it's been something that has been going on for quite some time. And that, folks, is the end of our presentation today. So I definitely thank you so much for allowing us into this space, whether it be virtual, whether in person, or whether it be me on a recording. I do appreciate being able to bring this information and this knowledge to my community. It's very, very near and dear to my heart. So on the screen, you will definitely see our address and contact information for all of our primary locations. So our main office, our California Street office, our Lodi office, and then the number that is available for folks that are in Manteca or Tracy in the South County areas if they would like to make an appointment for services. We also have on the right side of the screen our 24-hour helplines. Those are highlighted in yellow. So we have one for domestic violence, we have one for sexual assault, and we also have a youth and human trafficking hotline as well. So all three are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That includes weekends and holidays. And somebody will always be there to pick up the phone, to offer resources, to offer advice, or to just simply listen. You can definitely learn more at our website, womencenteryfs.org, and follow us on all of our social media. It's where we post about our events that we either are going to be going to or have been at. And you can really get connected with our agency to see what we're doing, not just within Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but throughout the whole entire year. And again, all of our services are free, voluntary, and confidential. We do not discriminate based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. All are able to get services here, including their families. And we just want to be here to help and support folks. So again, I appreciate the time today. Thank you so much. And please, please, please reach out if you are in need of anything, if you know somebody that is in need of anything, or you would like to volunteer with us and continue to raise awareness about sexual assault, as well as all of the other victimizations that we provide services for. So thank you again. My name is Adriana Griffiths. I'm the Outreach Program Coordinator, and it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, and take care.